On January 11, 1998, in Post Falls, Idaho, the police got a call from Randy and Laura Loesch requesting a welfare check. They were the brother and sister-in-law of a woman named Barbara Loesch. Officer Greg McLean was on the scene first, and he talked to the relatives who said that Barbara had lived alone and that Laura spoke with her regularly but hadn't heard from her in a while. They went over her medical conditions, which gave Officer McLean the impression that Barbara might have been incapacitated by something medically. When backup arrived, they checked the door and found that it was locked. Randy had a spare key which he used to open the door. The officers checked the living areas and didn't notice any sign of a struggle, but suddenly Randy yelled out that Barbara was in the hot tub. On the second-floor porch, Barbara was found floating in the hot tub, and it was clear that she had been there for at least a few days. Her body had already begun to decompose. As the officers took a closer look, they noticed that there was a small television floating in the water. It seemed possible that Barbara had accidentally knocked the TV into the hot tub and died of electrocution. It was then that Randy told the officers that Barbara had been depressed since the death of her husband a few years earlier. That meant it was possible that Barbara had intentionally dropped the TV into the water in an effort to end her own life. The officers immediately began investigating the situation, and they found that the TV had been plugged in with a 25-foot extension cord that went through the door into the garage. When they followed the cord, though, they found it wasn't plugged into the wall. It made it impossible for Barbara to have been electrocuted accidentally or by her own hand. The only other option would be if someone else unplugged the cord afterward, which would mean she was murdered. This is Monsters. It was Gary Loesch's murder that marked the beginning of a tragic chain of events. On November 15, 1995, the Kootenai County Sheriff's Department received a call about a suspicious vehicle parked on the side of the road. Sheriff's deputies found Gary dead inside his maroon Toyota Camry, engine still running, next to a group of mailboxes at about 7 a.m. Blood was pooled in the front passenger seat where he fell after the assault. Gary worked as a Spokesman Review newspaper carrier, and his death left investigators baffled about the motive. Tina Loesch was born in 1971 to Gary and Barbara Loesch. She had one older brother, Charles, and the family moved to the Spokane Valley in the late 1970s, eventually putting down roots in Post Falls, Idaho, just over the border from Washington state. Gary worked with entertainment machines such as pool tables and arcade games. He also had a paper route which he completed in the early morning hours before his regular job. Barbara was a nursing assistant who worked in assisted living facilities. They lived a typical middle-class family life through the 80s, and Tina, being the baby of the family, would end up getting anything she wanted. That would create a situation where she learned exactly how to manipulate her parents to serve her needs. Always getting her way meant she didn't have to work for anything, so she wasn't particularly successful academically. She also had a penchant for dating boys who were troublemakers. A girl who went for the bad boy, so to speak. That led her down a path of rebellion to the point she started to steal from her parents. When she was caught, they would attempt to get her in line, but the more rules they gave her, the more she rebelled. She ended up dropping out of high school and running away from home, most likely living with those bad boys she liked so much. When Tina was 18 years old, she gave birth to a son named Christopher, but she didn't return to her parents. She continued to drift from couch to couch, infant son in tow. She survived by committing petty theft, which eventually escalated to forgery and identity theft. When she was arrested in 1990 for check fraud, she was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Christopher was sent to live with her parents, and it seemed that, despite the circumstances, Gary and Barbara were thrilled to have a grandchild. In prison, Tina was not being rehabilitated. Instead, she was being introduced to much harder and more dangerous criminals, people who would have an even more profound impact on her life. The most important of them would be her cellmate, 26-year-old Skye Hanson. Skye Hanson was born in 1964 and grew up in Lewiston, Idaho, also a city on the border of Washington state, about 125 miles or 200 kilometers south of Post Falls. She was a good student in high school and known as a leader amongst her classmates. That was just a mask, though, as Skye was hiding the fact that she was gay. Most places in the U.S. in the 70s would have been aggressively against her sexual preference, but especially in small-town Idaho. She knew that she had to live a lie in order to not become a victim of at least ridicule, but likely violence. The pressure of that decision caused Skye to ultimately turn to drugs. The personality traits that had made her a leader in school soon took on more of a controlling nature. She became aggressive and manipulative. After high school, Skye's drug use continued and she started selling in order to make a living. She quickly made a name for herself. Her aggressive, fearless attitude put her at the top of the pecking order in the local drug scene. It was in 1990 that she was finally arrested on drug charges and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Once behind bars, Skye's behavior didn't change. She immediately established herself as the dominant woman in the prison. She bullied and manipulated the other inmates and became the most feared woman on the block. When Tina was assigned to be her cellmate, the two instantly formed a connection. Skye was attracted to Tina, who was young and pretty, and Tina liked that Skye was a bad girl and, of course, that she could protect her from the other inmates. Their status as cellmates quickly changed to lovers. For the next few years, the women's relationship grew into an obsession with each other, so by the time they were released around the same time, they were willing to do anything for each other. Tina regained custody of her son Christopher, and they rented a house just outside of Lewiston. She got a job and stayed out of trouble, even mending her relationship with her parents. Unfortunately, that meant hiding her relationship with Skye, as her conservative parents would not have approved. Tina and Skye eventually started their own business doing home improvements, and when they needed some extra help, they hired a man named Bradley Steckman. Bradley was a reformed drug user who was able to help the women with bigger projects, and for a while, it seemed like the three of them were successfully turning their lives around. When Gary's body was found in his car in 1995, he had a single bullet wound behind his left ear. The police didn't have any clue as to why he had been killed. There was no weapon or shell casings at the scene. They did find a cigarette butt on the ground near the vehicle, as well as some tire tracks in the dirt. Gary's brother Randy and his son Charles showed up at the scene not long after the deputies and told them they had gone out in search of Gary when he didn't return home at his usual time. They said they had also started getting calls that some customers hadn't received a paper. Detectives found it unusual, and they both initially became suspects. They got DNA samples from them and tried to match them to the DNA on the cigarette butt, but it turned out that the DNA belonged to a female. It wasn't a good enough sample to get a full profile, though, so all they could tell was that it didn't belong to Randy or Charles. Investigators spoke with both Barbara and Tina, but they couldn't think of anyone who would have wanted Gary dead. Gary was described as a happy, nice guy, and the detectives heard that he was thrilled to have his daughter back on the straight and narrow. As far as they could tell, Gary had a rock-solid relationship with both of his children. As detectives continued their investigation, they found a witness who said he saw a pickup truck speeding away from the area that morning. He told them it was a white pickup truck, but that he couldn't see the driver or a plate number. A white pickup truck in Idaho didn't really narrow down their search much, and the case eventually went cold. Then, just over 2 years later, authorities in Post Falls were baffled over the death of another member of the Loesch family. Barbara's autopsy didn't give investigators any clues as to the cause of her death. Her body was too decomposed to get a blood sample for toxicology. The medical examiner had ended up listing the cause of death as accidental. The investigators once again suspected Randy was responsible for the crime. Like when they had shown up at Gary's crime scene 2 years prior, they found it suspicious that he had been at Barbara's house but refused to go inside until the officers had arrived. When interviewed, he explained that since he had been a suspect in his brother's murder, he thought the best thing would be to not go in the house alone. It was also revealed that Randy had borrowed some money from Barbara and that her death would clearly benefit him financially, but he and his family had assured them that Randy had been paying her back and would never kill someone over money. When Gary was murdered, detectives had spoken to his family members, but now that Barbara was also dead, they decided to go deeper and started interviewing Gary's friends. What they learned was that the relationship between Gary and Tina was not as great as they had been led to believe. Gary had come to realize that Skye, who he was originally told was Tina's roommate and business partner, was actually her girlfriend. Not only did Gary not approve of their lifestyle, but their home improvement business was just barely making enough money, and Skye was pressing Tina to ask her parents to help out. Once it was clear that Gary didn't support their relationship, Tina decided to cut her parents off from seeing their grandson, the same boy they spent 2 years raising while she was in prison. As a last-ditch effort to resolve the situation, Gary called Tina and attempted to bribe her into breaking up with Skye. Of course, Tina refused and told her father that she would never leave Skye. So, in retaliation, Gary disowned his daughter, banishing her from the family, and even changed his will, but not to completely exclude her from any inheritance. No, he changed his will so, upon his death, Tina would get $1. It was intentionally put into the will to be a slap in the face. It was convenient then that Gary died soon after, and Tina was able to reconcile her relationship with Barbara. But it didn't seem like Tina was trying to get back into the will. That became clear when investigators found a $500,000 life insurance policy on Barbara with a single beneficiary, Tina Loesch. Investigators tried to talk to Tina, but she stalled. At the same time, since the medical examiner had listed Barbara's cause of death as accidental, the insurance company had no reason not to pay out on the policy. The next time detectives tried to talk to Tina, they were contacted by a lawyer who wouldn't let them talk to his clients. There was no evidence that Tina or Skye were involved in Barbara's death, so it wasn't long before Tina collected the insurance payout and she, Skye, and Christopher disappeared. Law enforcement launched an extensive search operation in 1999 that included monitoring border crossings and plane flights. There was no trace of where they had gone, and having $500,000 to aid in their disappearance seemed to work out for them. In 2001, a man was arrested in Clarkston, Washington, just over the border from Lewiston, Idaho. See what they did there? Lewiston, Clarkston. Clever. It turned out that man was Bradley Steckman, the same man who had worked for Tina and Skye in the 90s. In 1996, 89-year-old Dorothy Martin was killed during a robbery at her home. It turned out that Dorothy had been a customer of Tina and Skye's, and she was known for wearing a large diamond ring. Bradley broke into her house at night to steal the ring, but Dorothy woke up. Bradley ended up smothering her with a pillow and fleeing with the ring. After a few years, Bradley's wife became suspicious of how he came into possession of such a valuable piece of jewelry, and she ended up turning him in. He was charged with first-degree murder, and looking at a stiff sentence, he decided to fish for a deal by confessing to involvement in the murders of Gary and Barbara Loesch. He explained that Skye had convinced Tina that they should kill Gary so that Tina could get closer to her mother. Bradley said they paid him to follow Gary on his paper route and find the best spot to commit the crime. Once he did, he gave them the location and they were the ones who killed him. He said he didn't know who pulled the trigger, but he assumed it would have been Skye because she was so cold-blooded. A few years later, Tina had promised him $10,000 to help kill her mother. Bradley explained that over the 2 years between Gary and Barbara's death, Tina had been gradually bleeding her mother dry. Tina found ways to milk every penny from her mother, and when it started to run out, she and Skye came up with a plan for a big insurance payout. Tina had convinced her mother that the insurance would benefit her and Charles in the event of her death. Then, since Barbara spent time in the hot tub every evening due to her bad back, Tina gave her a gift: a small television so she could stay entertained while she soaked. It was given to her with the specific purpose of being used to make her death look accidental. Bradley told the detectives that he had added salt to the hot tub water to make it more conductive. Then he went with Tina to have dinner with Barbara on the night of her death. Tina claimed that he was an old friend and they all ate a meal before getting into the hot tub so Barbara could watch her favorite show. At some point, Bradley claimed he needed to use the restroom and then Tina got up to refill their drinks, leaving Barbara in the water alone. That was Bradley's moment to make his move. He pushed the television into the hot tub with the assumption it would kill her, but it didn't. It only knocked her out. Afraid she would regain consciousness, he unplugged the TV so they didn't get electrocuted, and Tina held her head underwater until she was dead. Bradley admitted that he told Tina to make sure she held her underwater for more than 2 minutes. It seemed that they forgot to plug the extension cord back in when they were done. If they had, the police might never have questioned whether the death was accidental. Bradley claimed that Tina and Skye also paid him to steal the diamond ring from Dorothy Martin. It was only supposed to be a theft, but when she woke up, he ended up killing her. Now investigators knew for sure that Tina and Skye were involved in multiple deaths, but they had no idea where they were. On top of that, Bradley's status as a co-conspirator made his testimony inadmissible in court, so they weren't able to use it to get arrest warrants for the women. Over the next few years, investigators did everything they could to track down Tina and Skye. In 2008, the 10th anniversary of Barbara's murder, authorities decided to push the information about the couple to the national media. The fugitives were profiled on America's Most Wanted in November, and that ended up flushing them out of hiding, but not into custody. A couple of buddies were out in the desert drinking when they saw a white Dodge Durango southwest of Tucson, Arizona. Local authorities rushed to the scene around 11:30 p.m. and found the bodies of Tina Loesch, 37, and Skye Hanson, 41. Skye was sitting in the back seat with a gunshot wound to her head, and Tina was in the front seat also with a gunshot wound to her head. The gun was still in Tina's hand. It was determined that Tina had shot Skye before turning the gun on herself. Investigators found an 8-page letter next to their bodies. In it, Tina admitted that she had ruined her family, but she did not admit to any murders. She claimed they were all carried out by Bradley Steckman. She claimed he learned about the life insurance policy and came up with his own plan to murder Barbara. It was also concerning that the letter contained no information about Tina's son Christopher, who would have been 18 at the time. The police launched a massive search when they became worried about his safety. They brought in cadaver dogs to search locations in Arizona after hearing rumors that the couple might have hurt him, but they couldn't find him anywhere. The women's house held more troubling evidence. They had packed their things in boxes and stored them in the garage. A detective noted that they had placed hundreds of dryer sheets underneath the boxes, possibly to hide something that smelled bad. Despite that, Christopher was not located anywhere they looked. It was later revealed that the couple made Arizona their home and managed to stay undetected for at least 8 years. They created new identities to blend into their surroundings. Tina became Dawn and Skye chose to go with Katie. They enrolled Christopher in school under the name Christopher Hanson. They changed his first name from being spelled with a K to being spelled with a CH. The women blended smoothly into their new community and managed to keep a low profile while building a normal-looking life in Tucson. They made their living by doing home improvements just like they had in Idaho. Neighbors said that Christopher lived with his mother until 2002, but she said she had to send him to his father in Spokane because of behavior issues. No one knew who Christopher's real father was since his birth certificate didn't list one. Finding him has been made more complicated because he used several fake names over the years. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children kept posting bulletins about his disappearance over the years. He would be 34 years old now, and his whereabouts are still unknown. Bradley Steckman was sentenced to life in prison for his roles in the murders of Barbara Loesch and Dorothy Martin. He died in prison in 2002. Tina and Skye's criminal saga shows evidence of the complex challenges modern law enforcement faces while pursuing sophisticated criminals. Their murders were planned carefully and they escaped methodically. They knew how to create new identities, which showed how difficult it becomes for authorities to investigate cases across multiple jurisdictions. The case frustrated investigators for years until an America's Most Wanted broadcast finally led to a breakthrough. Unfortunately, that broadcast pushed the fugitives to choose death over going back to prison. Despite getting some answers about Gary Loesch's murder, there are still questions. They accompany the questions about Christopher Loesch's fate, but they're questions that can never be answered. They will remain mysteries because Tina Loesch and Skye Hanson chose they would rather die as monsters than give closure. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.